This wasn't just another loud sports debate that fades after a few clips. One comment flipped the entire conversation around the Cleveland Browns quarterback room and forced people to confront something they'd been avoiding all along. Because when G. Bush spoke up, he didn't sound like someone chasing clicks. He sounded like someone who was done playing along. What started as routine quarterback chatter suddenly felt uncomfortable. Analysts were tossing around future draft names, hypothetical fixes, and long-term what-ifs, as if the Browns didn't already have answers standing right in front of them. And that's when Bush snapped the script in half. No hedging, no polite disagreement, just a direct challenge to the entire way this conversation was being framed. Because according to him, the problem wasn't talent, it was trust, or more accurately, the lack of it. Trust in the front office, trust in the media, trust in the idea that the Browns somehow need to keep starting over instead of actually evaluating what's already in the room. And right in the middle of that firestorm sat a name that had been quietly dismissed for months: Shedeur Sanders. Bush didn't introduce Sanders with hype or drama. He did something far more dangerous. He compared him. Stack him up against the quarterbacks people keep drooling over. Put the tape side by side. Talk production instead of potential. And once you do that, the conversation gets real uncomfortable real fast. That's why this moment spread so quickly. Not because it was loud, but because it exposed how fragile the narrative really was. Fans weren't just reacting to a take. They were reacting to the idea that they'd been looking in the wrong direction the entire time. And that realization set off a chain reaction that Cleveland couldn't ignore, because what came next wasn't speculation. It was accountability. In Cleveland, quarterback conversations don't feel like normal football debates. They feel personal. That's because the Cleveland Browns have spent years cycling through promises, resets, and supposed answers that never quite stuck. Every new season comes with optimism, and every setback reopens old scars. Fans aren't just skeptical anymore, they're exhausted. That history is why trust is the real issue inside the Browns quarterback room. Not arm talent, not draft position, trust. When analysts casually throw out new names or future draft prospects, it lands differently in Cleveland. To fans, it sounds like the same movie playing on repeat. Another reset, another excuse to ignore what's already in the building. That skepticism only deepened with the handling of Deshaun Watson. Big expectations, massive investment, and long stretches of uncertainty turned every QB discussion into a referendum on leadership and decision-making. Even when wins came, doubts never fully disappeared. So now, anytime the media starts projecting the next move, fans immediately ask the same question. Do they actually know something, or are they just guessing again? That's the backdrop most outsiders miss. The Browns' QB room isn't evaluated in a vacuum. It's evaluated through years of frustration, false hope, and constant noise. So when conversations shift toward hypothetical college quarterbacks or future drafts, many fans tune out. They've heard it before, and they don't want another long-term plan built on maybes. This is exactly why the reaction was so intense when Shedeur Sanders entered the discussion. Not because he was crowned anything, but because his presence challenged the cycle. He represented a different question, not who's next, but who's already here and being ignored. And once that question entered the room, the entire debate changed. Because if the Browns have learned anything, it's that chasing the future while overlooking the present is how you stay stuck. And that realization made everything that followed feel a lot more serious. What made this moment explode wasn't volume or theatrics. It was control. G. Bush didn't walk into that discussion looking to trade opinions. He walked in knowing exactly where the conversation was broken, and he went straight for it. While everyone else danced around hypotheticals and future draft fantasies, Bush planted his feet in reality and refused to move. He didn't start by hyping anyone up. That's what caught people off guard. No emotional buildup, no dramatic proclamation, just a calm dismantling of the logic being used around him. The panel was talking about what the Browns might do, who they could draft, and which college quarterbacks were supposedly next up. Bush flipped it instantly. Why are we pretending those guys are automatically better than what's already here? Why are we acting like potential outweighs production? That question alone shifted the entire energy in the room. Because once you strip away draft buzz and name recognition, you're left with tape, reps, and results. And that's where the conversation got uncomfortable. Bush wasn't attacking players, he was attacking lazy evaluation. He pointed out that the same voices dismissing Shedeur Sanders were the ones inflating quarterbacks who hadn't proven anything at the next level. Not in practice, not under NFL pressure, not in real situations. What made it sting even more was how composed he stayed. There was no ranting, no scrambling for words, just steady pressure. Every time someone tried to pivot back to upside or long-term planning, Bush dragged it right back to the present. You don't fix instability by ignoring the quarterback who's actually showing growth. You don't regain trust by restarting the clock every offseason. And the panel felt it. You could hear it in the pauses, see it in the body language, because Bush wasn't wrong and nobody had a clean counter. That's why the clip went viral. Not because it was loud, but because it exposed a gap between media narratives and on-field reality. By the time the segment ended, the conversation was no longer about possibilities. It was about accountability. If Sanders wasn't being taken seriously, the question became why. And once that door opened, it couldn't be closed again. What Bush did in that moment wasn't spark debate. He forced everyone watching to reevaluate what they thought they knew about the Browns' quarterback situation. This is where the conversation really cracked open. Because once G. Bush stopped playing along with the draft hype machine, the entire structure of the argument collapsed. For years, fans have been trained to believe the same story. If your quarterback situation feels unstable, the answer must be somewhere in the next college class. Not development, not patience, just the next name. Bush challenged that thinking head-on. He didn't say college quarterbacks were useless. He said they were being overvalued, especially when compared to players who had already survived NFL pressure. Names like Carson Beck, Drew Aller, and others kept coming up as solutions, but Bush forced the uncomfortable comparison. What exactly are they doing better right now? Not projected traits, not arm strength in shorts, actual execution. That's the part people didn't want to hear, because college hype is easy, it's clean, it comes without consequences. You can dream on upside without dealing with mistakes. But once you bring tape into the conversation, once you talk accuracy, decision-making, and composure, the gap between hype and reality starts to show. Bush wasn't attacking prospects. He was attacking the assumption that being new automatically makes you better. And that's where Shedeur Sanders became the quiet centerpiece of the argument. While others were being praised for what they might become, Sanders was being ignored for what he'd already shown. That contradiction sat at the heart of Bush's critique. If performance matters, then why does the conversation keep drifting away from the player actually performing? Some reports suggest teams still prioritize body type, raw arm talent, and coachability over efficiency and poise. Fans have speculated that Sanders' slide wasn't about football at all, but about comfort, about noise, about control. Whether that's true or not, Bush's point landed because it exposed a familiar pattern. The league falls in love with the unknown while undervaluing the inconvenient truth standing right in front of them. By the end of that segment, the college quarterback hype didn't disappear, but it lost its authority. It stopped being the automatic answer. And once that happened, the focus shifted. If the next savior isn't guaranteed, then the spotlight has to return to the present. And that made everything about the Browns' quarterback room feel a lot more real and a lot harder to ignore. The moment Shedeur Sanders slid in the draft, the narrative around him changed overnight. Not because his play declined, not because his production vanished, but because perception took over. In today's NFL, draft position quietly shapes how a player is talked about, evaluated, and even trusted. And once Sanders didn't hear his name early, the conversation shifted from football to suspicion. That slide shocked a lot of people who actually watched the tape. At the college level, Sanders wasn't just productive. He was efficient, composed, and consistent under pressure. He didn't rely on chaos or broken plays. He operated within structure, delivered on time, and led an offense that depended on him every snap. Yet when draft weekend arrived, teams hesitated. Reports claimed concerns about physical traits. Others whispered about leadership evaluations. Some even hinted that the spotlight surrounding his last name made front offices uneasy. Whether those concerns were real or exaggerated, the result was the same. Sanders became labeled before he ever threw an NFL pass. A fifth-round quarterback doesn't get described as the future. He gets described as depth, as insurance, as a long shot. And once that label sticks, it becomes incredibly hard to shake, no matter how well you play. When the NFL draft finally ended and the Cleveland Browns made the call, the reaction was split. Some fans saw value. Others saw another experiment. But almost no one saw a legitimate challenger to the existing quarterback hierarchy. That wasn't because Sanders lacked ability. It was because the league had already decided where he fit in the story. What made this moment so important is what came next. Sanders didn't arrive trying to rewrite the narrative. He didn't talk louder. He didn't chase attention. He worked. Practice by practice, rep by rep, he stayed steady while expectations stayed low. And in a quarterback room built on uncertainty, that approach quietly stood out. This is why the slide mattered so much. It didn't just delay opportunity, it created a blind spot. Analysts stopped tracking progress. Media discussions skipped past him, and that allowed assumptions to harden without evidence. By the time his name came up again, it was usually framed as an afterthought. But that's exactly what made the debate explode later. Because once people were forced to look again, the disconnect became obvious. The fall wasn't about talent disappearing. It was about comfort levels shifting. And once that realization set in, Sanders' slide stopped looking like a verdict and started looking like the moment everything changed. Once the draft buzz faded, reality set in. The Cleveland Browns didn't treat Shedeur Sanders like a headline addition. They treated him like what his draft slot suggested, a developmental piece, someone expected to learn quietly while the spotlight stayed elsewhere. That alone shaped how most people viewed his future. Late-round quarterbacks aren't supposed to disrupt plans. They're supposed to wait. The depth chart told that story clearly. Veterans and higher investment players sat ahead of him, soaking up attention and reps. Sanders wasn't handed anything. He wasn't marketed as a savior or fast-tracked as a solution. Instead, he entered one of the league's most scrutinized quarterback rooms knowing every mistake would be magnified, while every success might go unnoticed. And that's exactly where many late picks disappear. But something subtle started happening behind the scenes. While the conversation outside the building focused on contracts, injuries, and future drafts, Sanders stayed steady. No noise, no frustration leaking out, just consistent preparation. Coaches noticed how quickly he picked up the system. Teammates noticed how he carried himself in meetings. None of it made headlines, but all of it mattered. As the season unfolded, circumstances shifted. Depth charts always do. Injuries, trades, and performance changes opened cracks in what once looked settled. When opportunities came, even limited ones, Sanders didn't look overwhelmed. He looked composed. He protected the ball. He made the right reads. He didn't try to be spectacular, and that's what stood out the most. That's where the disconnect began to grow. Public perception still framed him as a long shot, but internally, he stopped being invisible. Not because he demanded attention, but because he earned trust. And in a quarterback room defined by uncertainty, trust is currency. Every clean rep chipped away at the assumption that he was just filling space. This is the part most draft narratives skip. Development doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up quietly, long before the audience is ready to notice. By the time discussions about the Browns' future resurfaced, Sanders was no longer just the fifth-round pick. He was a legitimate option, whether people wanted to admit it or not. And that's why the debate later hit so hard. Because what happened after the draft didn't match the story people told on draft night. Sanders didn't fade into the background. He positioned himself right in the middle of the conversation, patiently, deliberately, waiting for the moment when everyone else would finally have to catch up. What made this entire situation uncomfortable wasn't the football talk. It was what it revealed about how narratives are protected. When G. Bush pushed back, he didn't just question evaluations. He challenged the system that decides which quarterbacks are allowed to be taken seriously. And once that system was exposed, there was no unseeing it. Media bias in sports rarely looks intentional. It's subtle. It shows up in which players get patience and which ones get labeled early. First-round quarterbacks are projects. Mid-round quarterbacks are developmental. Late-round quarterbacks are depth. Those labels stick long before anyone has enough evidence to justify them. And once they're attached, coverage follows the script instead of the performance. That's exactly what happened with Shedeur Sanders. From the moment he slid in the draft, the tone around him changed. Analysts stopped asking what he could become and started asking why he fell. Every conversation framed him as an exception, not a possibility. Meanwhile, college quarterbacks with no NFL snaps were treated as inevitable upgrades simply because they hadn't failed yet. Bush's critique cut through that contradiction. He didn't argue that Sanders was flawless. He argued that the evaluation process itself was broken. Why is potential treated as more valuable than proof? Why do media conversations keep resetting to the future instead of acknowledging progress in the present? Those questions didn't have clean answers, and that's why the reaction was defensive. Some reports claim front offices still influence media narratives more than fans realize. Access matters. Relationships matter. Staying aligned with league thinking matters. And when a player doesn't fit neatly into that thinking, coverage becomes cautious, neutral, detached. Sanders didn't fit the preferred story arc, so the spotlight moved elsewhere. What Bush did was force the spotlight back, not by demanding praise, but by demanding consistency. If mistakes are magnified for some quarterbacks, then growth should matter just as much. If competition is real, then draft status shouldn't end it before it begins. That stance didn't just defend one player, it exposed how selective credibility can be. By the time the segment ended, the conversation wasn't really about the Browns anymore. It was about trust in analysis itself. Fans weren't just debating quarterbacks. They were questioning who decides which opinions matter and why. And once that doubt enters the room, it changes everything. That's why this moment lingered. Not because it crowned a starter, but because it cracked the illusion of objectivity. The bias didn't disappear, but it was visible. And once fans see it, they stop accepting narratives at face value. That shift, more than any stat line, is what made this moment impossible to ignore. By the time the noise settled, one thing was clear. The conversation around the Cleveland Browns quarterback room wasn't the same anymore. Not because a starter had been named, not because a roster move was announced, but because the old assumptions stopped holding up. What once felt like a fixed storyline suddenly looked fragile, even forced. For months, the narrative had been simple. Look ahead, plan for the next draft, assume the answer isn't already here. But moments like this have a way of exposing how lazy that thinking can be. When Shedeur Sanders became the center of debate, it wasn't about crowning him as a savior. It was about acknowledging that the evaluation process itself had been skewed from the start. Draft position mattered more than development. Projection mattered more than progress. That shift is subtle, but it's powerful. Once fans start questioning why certain quarterbacks are dismissed while others are endlessly protected by upside, the conversation changes. It stops being about hope and starts being about honesty. Sanders didn't force that shift with headlines or hype. He did it by staying present, steady, and ready while the narrative kept looking past him. This is where the Browns now find themselves. Every decision moving forward will be scrutinized through a different lens. If Sanders continues to develop, ignoring him becomes harder to justify. If the team pivots back to chasing the future without fully evaluating the present, fans will notice. The benefit of doubt is gone. Accountability has entered the room. What makes this moment linger is that it wasn't manufactured. It wasn't a marketing push or a preseason buzz cycle. It came from friction, from someone willing to say what others wouldn't and force a pause. And once that pause happens, people start rewatching, reconsidering, and reconnecting the dots. Sanders' story is no longer about where he was drafted. It's about where he's headed and who's willing to admit they might have been wrong. That's a dangerous place for narratives built on certainty, because growth doesn't announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just keeps showing up until denial becomes impossible. As Cleveland moves forward, one thing is undeniable: the question has changed. It's no longer who's next. It's what if the answer has been here longer than we realized? And once that question takes hold, the narrative doesn't just shift, it stays shifted.